Bienvenidos a este Hopecast. Esto es un Hopecast de súper mega lujo. De verdad que estamos muy felices. Este Hopecast es un sueño hecho realidad. Definitivamente agradecemos a Dios y agradecemos la trayectoria que hemos ido recorriendo. Hoy tenemos una oportunidad de entrevistar a una persona de renombre mundial que está en nuestro país, en República Dominicana hoy. Y si ven un nuevo formato, que mañana precisamente tenemos el evento Encuentro Autismo 2024 y secuestramos un salón en el hotel donde vamos a realizar el evento y aquí estamos con el doctor Robert Melillo. Welcome, doctor.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Dominican Republic. How do you feel?
I'm really happy to be here. This is a great event. I'm really grateful that you've asked me to be here, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, doctor. So, para los que no conocen al doctor Melillo, si no sé cómo no lo conocen, pero los que no lo conozcan, es un destacado experto en afecciones neurológicas del desarrollo. ¿Cuáles? TDAH, autismo, TOC, tics, dislexia, tú lo puedes mencionar. Con un amplio conocimiento de la función cerebral, ha perfeccionado un método multimodal no invasivo para mejorar y corregir, importante decir eso, corregir significativamente muchos trastornos neurológicos. Su experiencia, tomaríamos una eternidad terminar acá, pero básicamente tiene más de 30 años como médico, profesor, investigador del cerebro y ha escrito varios bestsellers, que uno de ellos es Niños Desconectados, que ahora mismo salió su tercera edición. Quieren conocer muchísimo más, vaya a Google y revisen, porque al final del día tenemos a una persona de lujo en medio de este Hopecast. Así que, thank you very much, doctor. Thank you. You don't know how much we thank you for being here.
That is my reward, actually, so that's great. Thank you.
We'll get right into this. We want to know, from your perspective, your 30 years working with families, your own experience, obviously, what is autism?
That's a big question.
I know, I'm sure.
But I define it in neurological terms.
Right.
I think we're very familiar, probably your audience is very familiar with the symptoms, and they vary from children to adults, but they're all fall into certain categories. And for me, it really all comes down to what is actually happening in the brain that explains a lot of the symptoms that we see. You know, things like tics or stimming behavior, OCD behaviors, some hyperactivity, where some children have problems with emotional regulation. They also almost always have different problems with their immune system and their digestive system and their autonomic system. They almost all have certain types of motor issues in coordination or low muscle tone. And for me, that's always been the search as to how do you explain all that? And what our research has shown is that predominantly there's a developmental delay, which means that we look at brain imaging, we look at all different types of ways of looking at the brain, looking at patients, children and adults. And there is no damage in the brain, there's no injury. What we see is there's a developmental, maturational imbalance and delay that primarily impacts the development of the right hemisphere and different areas in the right hemisphere, which can vary from child to child. And then usually where the left hemisphere is overactive or even more developed. And so we may see like overconnectivity in some areas of the brain and underconnectivity in the brain, which again we describe as more of a maturational imbalance. And to me, that's where all the symptoms come in. And it starts from what we call bottom up, meaning that there's a problem where the development of the brain develops from the bottom up, like building a building is what I use in an analogy, where it starts in the bottom, and the bottom of the brain stem is called the medulla, and that is where the brain starts its development, and that's also where all of these things called primitive reflexes come from. It's also where the nuclei that regulate the digestive system and the immune system are maturing or supposed to mature. The vestibular inner ear comes from that area, some aspects of the way their eyes move and their balance, and that it literally growing, like as it grows, it matures, and the brain builds from the bottom up, and then the right brain develops first in the first 2 to 3 years, and then after 2 to 3 years, the left brain develops, and then we have what's called top-down regulation, where the brain then comes down to regulate everything. At the same time, the right and left sides of the brain are becoming more and more different from one another. They're specializing, which is a great advantage. And the right brain, again, develops more first than the left brain. And at the end of 4 to 6 years, they should both be fairly equal in their development and in their physical maturation. And what we are able to show is that that doesn't happen that way, that there is a delay. And quite often what happens, we believe, and what we've seen, is that the right brain is halted or slowed, and then that left brain comes online too early, and that suppresses that right brain development. And all of the symptoms that we see, no matter what they are, what the combination is, really is in that gap between that right and left brain. And what also starts it, and I believe one of the causative factors, is that in my experience, everyone who has autism spectrum that is not what we call syndromic, meaning that doesn't have a clear genetic issue, they're brilliant with their left brain, that it starts with a gift. It starts with these people being super gifted with the left side of the brain. It runs in the family. It's kind of like what we would describe as an engineering type of brain. And we see that that is the gift, but then that is also what causes that left brain to come online too early, and then that causes this imbalance. And again, we see that it disrupts not just their mental capacities or their cognitive abilities, but it affects their motor skills. It affects their ability to process sensory information, so that they have imbalances in how they process sensory information. They may be too sensitive to other things and really undersensitive to other things. And it also has a big impact on their gut development, on their immune system development, on the balance of inflammation and anti-inflammation. And so all of the symptoms that we see really come from that problem with what we call vertical integration and horizontal integration. And to me, that is really what is autism.
Wonderful. Thank you, doctor. So in your book, you have this term, functional disconnection syndrome.
Yes.
So if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's, I have a lab and I have research partners that are, all over the world. And our main focus is what we call functional disconnection. So in the really late 80s, early 90s, a lot of the research that was coming out in the brain was with new brain imaging, things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or different things like EEG and QEEG and other types of ways of looking at the brain in real time. It became pretty clear that in most mental or developmental issues, there wasn't any damage in the brain. There wasn't any lesions anywhere. But there was a problem with the communication and the connectivity in the brain, the functional connectivity. Not that there was damage anatomically, and there wasn't a physical disconnection, but there was the flow of information was disrupted in one way or the other. And normally, the right and left brain and different areas of the brain need to be very fluid. They need to be very connected to one another. And the brain has to do things very, very quickly. Any problem or anything that slows down the brain or makes it inefficient or disrupts this communication, we then refer to as a functional disconnection. And that's our main area that we look at. And when we look at what interferes with that flow, it ends up, what we've been able to show is that it's because of this maturational delay and imbalance. As the brain matures, a couple of things are really critical. One is that the right and the left brain become very different from one another and become highly specialized, and that is a great advantage. And humans have the most lateralized, asymmetric brain of any animals on the planet. And that's a good thing. That's the way it's supposed to happen. The brain also then needs to become more synchronized and coordinated and connected, so that as the brain is becoming different and it's growing, it also has to become faster and communicate better. And obviously it's growing physically. And anything that disrupts that is going to affect that communication. And what we think is disrupting it is that, again, certain areas, particularly in the right side, are immature and slower, whereas other areas of the brain are a little bit more mature and faster. So that's what we see. We've been able to show by looking at QEEG in the brain that in general the brain waves are slower in people with autism, in children, adolescents, and adults, which for us is really a signature of an immature brain, not a damaged brain, and that there's a difference where the right brain is slower than the left brain. In some kids with high functioning, we see that they have slow waves in the right and maybe really fast waves in the left. And because they're at different speeds, they can't communicate with one another. They're at a different processing speed. And we believe that is what's causing that functional disconnection.
Wow, this is all so amazing and so enriching. Thank you, doctor. So what's the role behind the primitive reflexes mentioned in your book, behind all this? What's its take?
Yeah, so humans have essentially the most immature brains of any animals on the planet at birth. And the reason for that is very specific. We have the largest brain per body size of any primate, but because we're bipedal, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have really big heads and a small birth canal relatively. So the brain has to stay, it can't grow too much too fast in the womb. So that it has to grow mostly when it's outside, and then in the first 3 years it goes from 20% of an adult size to 90% by the age of 3. So there's this explosive growth that happens. So first of all, the brain needs to be able to know when it's inside and when it's outside. So the genes that regulate brain development are very sensitive to environmental signals, more than any other animal, basically. And 85% of our genes are there to really grow our brain. And so once we're outside, we need to be able to sense, and the genes are stimulated by sound and light and temperature and gravity. And all of this needs to be initiated by movement. So we need to be able to move. But humans are the only animals that really can't get up and walk and run at birth. It takes at least a year for us to walk. So how do we move? Because we need to move to build the brain and to stimulate the senses and to interact with the world so that we turn on these genes that grow the brain, but yet the part of our brain that really volitionally controls our movement isn't formed yet. So we're born with these automatic, basic, reflexive movement patterns that are from the brainstem that help a baby to do basic movements to be able to, move and survive and really start their brain growth. Really from the very beginning, meaning that, a child miraculously gets themselves into the right position to be born. How does that happen, right? They should turn to the right, turn upside down, turn backwards. They should do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. And so, to do that, they have these automatic movements and these programs that are coming from their brainstem that allow them to do that. Then these reflexes are there to help them actually assist in their own birth, to help them get out of the womb. There's a reflex called the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, that if a baby turns their head, their arm and their leg on one side stretch out, the other side contracts. That helps them twist down the birth canal. Then there's something called the spinal galant in their back, that when you stroke their spine, they will flex against it, so it helps them push themselves out. And then there's something called the tonic labyrinthine reflex, that when a baby puts their head down, their whole body collapses. When they extend, it extends. So when they come through the birth canal, they extend and they should almost shoot themselves out. I just had a mom the other day who was telling me that the baby was not really in the right position, and then when they were stuck, and then when he was coming out, he came out and then was sucked back in, and they had to use a vacuum to get him out. Now, why would that happen? Well, because the baby's not assisting the way they're supposed to. And so these reflexes are there first and foremost for them to do that. Then those same reflexes are used for them to roll over from side to side within the first 3 to 5 months. And then they should crawl on their belly in the commando crawl, and they're using different reflexes to do that. And then they should get up on their hands and knees and start rocking, which is the beginning of what we call the symmetrical tonic neck reflex, and that shuts off the tonic labyrinthine reflex and should be shutting off the asymmetric. And then they crawl, and they should crawl on all fours in a perfectly symmetrical way, and they should do that for a few months. Then they're sitting up, pull up, stand up, and right around 12 months, all children should walk and talk a few words, 3 to 5 words, and they should be able to point and have eye contact at that point. And at that point, all the reflexes go away. So as they're coming through, these reflexes are there to help them move when they don't really have control of their movements from their brain yet, and allow them to move, go through their stages, engage the world and the senses, which builds the brain. And then as they go through that process, that reflex is also being inhibited or integrated. And then that allows for next stage of movement with other reflexes, which allows for them to go through that. And then right around, like I said, around 1 year when they're ready to walk, the reflex on the bottom of the foot called the Babinski is the last reflex that should go away just as they start walking. And then all these reflexes should go away. And now it allows for more complex movement and allows them to build the next stage of development of their brain. But if these reflexes don't go away and they don't become integrated, then they can alter all of that. So they may be in a breech position. They're not getting in the right position. They have the cord wrapped around their neck. They may not be able to come out of the womb, and they may need to have a C-section. And if they have a C-section, then they're not going through the birth canal, and they're not using these reflexes. And then the baby may not roll over, or they may roll to one side, not the other. And it's not just the time, but it's also how they do it. So a baby should not roll over by extending. They should roll over by sitting a little bit up and rolling over. So the way they do it matters. All of that matters. And it's really very programmed. I call it the brain developmental blueprint, and it's very specific as far as I'm concerned. And that is really the purpose of these things called primitive reflexes, and they need to be able to go away. And if they don't, they then hold back the brain, right? This is what our research has proven, is that, if they don't go away, what does that mean? And what it means is it keeps the brain in a more immature state. And then in children on the autism spectrum, because I believe their left brain is so strong, it comes online too early, even before the age of 1. I had one child that was reading at 8 months of age. Nobody should be able to read really before the age of 4.
Right.
If they're reading too early, it means that's a left brain skill, and it means that something isn't happening, and it means that, one, the left brain's coming on too early and too strong, but if that's happening, it means that right brain is not developing. And so all of the symptoms surrounding autism are really these overactivity or too early development of the left and really significant underdevelopment of the right. And I believe that a lot of what leads to that has something to do with them not moving properly, not having proper muscle tone, and that these reflexes aren't going away when they should.
So you mentioned about genes and the function of the genes, but is this in any way genetic?
That's a big phrase that most people don't understand that. And that's really one of the big misconceptions, I think, because people hear and have always been told that autism is genetic. And so from a standpoint of a gene mutation, like literally an altered gene, that doesn't happen. There's small percentage, 5 to 10%, that have a genetic mutation like Down syndrome or Fragile X or tuberous sclerosis, that it's a known mutation, or what's called a de novo mutation, but it's not inherited from their parents, And that is rare, but that is different. That's a different type of autism. The majority of autism, 85 to 90 to 95%, there is no genetic mutation of any significance, but there is what we call an epigenetic factor, meaning that genes are not damaged or broken or deleted, but they may not be coming on. They may not be being turned on the way that they're supposed to at the right time. And that has to do really more with environmental influences and, again, the way they're interacting with the world around them. And that is something that, we know that that's primarily what's happening. So there is a genetic component to it, meaning there's what we call epigenetic or epimutations, where the genes aren't being turned on, but they're not broken and they can be turned on later on. But the other genetic factor, when people talk about, a predisposition, what does that mean, right? We know that there's something called an autism trait. In the families of people with autism, the vast majority, probably 95% or more of the parents with kids with autism are not diagnosed with autism. Only about 19% of the siblings have autism. So, meaning 80 to 95% of the time, nobody else in their family has it. So again, if the parents don't have it, then how is it genetic? But we know that they share traits. They have personality traits, or the way that they do things, or characteristics that are similar. And we know Simon Baron-Cohen, top researcher out of Cambridge, has shown that in families of kids with autism, there's a much higher amount of people in the family that are engineers or physicists or professors, or they work in the computer technology world, or doctors or lawyers. They're very, very smart people. It's also looked at as an intellect trait. And the way I look at it is these are people that are primarily left brain dominant as a trait, as a cognitive style, the way they view the world. All of us are either more right brain or left brain in the way that we view the world. And if you have an extreme version of that trait, and then you have something epigenetically that interferes with the development, they all come together to be able to produce autism at all different levels of what we see. But none of that is really a genetic mutation or damage that we can't change. And so that's something that I think is very hopeful, because a lot of people were told, and a lot of professionals think, well, it's genetic, so there's nothing you can do about it. That's not true.
So there's a genetic misconception that we just talked about. What other misconceptions are out there?
The other misconception, I think, is you hear a lot, and for years you've heard that, autism is a brain injury. It's not. That's one of the things, when people come from all over the world to see me, and one of the first questions I ask them, has anybody tried to explain to you what's happening in your child's brain? And the answer almost 100% of the time is no. And I've been asking this question for 30 years. And so, we have very smart doctors out there, and they have people that are very dedicated that really want to help these individuals. So why don't they understand what the problem is? And a lot of it is because they're told that, this is it's a genetic mutation, which it's not. And a lot of people will have referred to it as a brain injury, and it's not. And part of the reason why it's so mysterious is because when there's imaging of the brain and anybody has looked at the brain, for the most part, we're not seeing any pathology. There's nothing wrong. There's, again, this little abnormality in the way that their brain is growing, but it's not pathological in any way. So that's another thing, because people think, well, there's a brain injury, I can't do anything. There's a genetic mutation, you can't do anything. And, that really started me a lot in my initial journey when my son was diagnosed, or I was told he had ADHD. And I went to many experts and friends of mine. I knew a lot about the brain at the time. I was already teaching a postgraduate course in clinical neurology, but I didn't work a lot with children, and I didn't work with ADHD or autism or any of the developmental issues at the time. And so I went out and I wanted to, but I was an expert in neurology and rehab. So I wanted to, what can I do for my own son to help him? And I went to talk to people, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, neuropsychologists, and I said, well, what is it? What's happening in the brain? And they looked at me and they all said, I don't know. I don't really know. I said, somebody must know. And they said, it has something to do maybe with dopamine or the frontal lobes, executive function. I said, but what's happening there? And they said, I don't know. And they said, why? And I said, because, I want to see if I can help my son. And they said, well, you can't help him. There's nothing you can do about it. And I said, wait, you just told me you don't know what it is, but yet you're absolutely sure I can't do anything about it. How does that work? That doesn't seem to work for me, right? So that's where, I dove into it with a father's love and also as a professional. And that's really what's led me on this journey. So, really, I think these misconceptions about, that nothing can be done and you can't change it, I always say, why? Why not? Like, point to me where we can't change it, right? Just because you don't understand something or just because you can't change it doesn't mean it can't be changed. And that's, I think, the hopeful message I like to give because, in medicine, there's a lot of practicing, trying to, feel like it's ethical that we don't want to give people false hope. And I understand that. But that doesn't mean you have to take away all hope.
Right.
Right? And that's where I try to find that balance.
Right. And sorry to get emotional, but the thing is that we heard that at the pediatrician's office. He said, as blunt as I'm saying it right now, no hay cura. There's no cure for that. There's nothing you can do. And that's what led us to all this way, to keep on looking and looking and looking. And that's something, sorry about this, that's something that we would like for you to tell our families who are watching us, what could be that road to hope, because there is.
Absolutely. Like I said, I look at it scientifically. I'm looking at it like, okay, if there was a genetic mutation, if there was an injury, if there wasn't any way to change it, I would be happy to say that if that was the case. But that's not what's out there in the scientific literature, and that's not the research that we've shown. And we've been able to show, that we can change it. We've published really, a pretty large study that we've been doing over the last several years. That's a randomized age-match controlled double-blind study looking at the relationship between retained primitive reflexes and autism spectrum in children, adolescents, and adults. And we've been able to show that even in a 12-week study, just teaching parents things that they can do at home to integrate the reflexes and to stimulate their right brain, that we've been able to get significant changes in neuropsychological measurements, in QEEG, and in functional magnetic resonance imaging, and in heart rate variability. So meaning we've shown that we can also change the way the digestive system works and the way the immune system works and all of that.
So it's at the end of the day, it's all an integrated way of looking at an approach, let's say. It's not only looking at the diet, not only looking at the supplements, not only looking at this and that, but it's as a whole.
Yeah, because that's the way the body works. Like we artificially in medicine break things into specialties and subspecialties. And there's a need for that, of course. But what happens is you lose the idea of understanding that the body actually works all together. All the systems are integrated. You don't have a cardiovascular system that works separately from the nervous system. You don't have a hormone system that's separate. You don't have a digestive system. So it really is all integrated. And for me, that's where I've spent my whole life really trying to understand all of that, to be able to understand how it all works together. Because when we see a child or a patient with autism, they have many things going on. We know that they have digestive issues, and we know that they have immune dysregulation, and we know that they have motor problems and sensory issues and cognitive issues and attentional problems. And so, we know that all of that, the one system that really is the master system is your brain and nervous system. And that's another big misconception, I think, out there from my perspective, is that people are told that these problems all start in the gut. And, I don't believe that's true. I believe it starts in the brainstem and in the brain and the balance of what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we published a paper on this in 2009, and we're doing a lot of work now looking at the really what we call functional neuroimmunology, the way the brain and the immune system and the autonomic system work. And so, you know, it really doesn't start in the gut. It doesn't start in the immune system. It doesn't start in the biomedical system. It starts in the nervous system. But that doesn't mean that those aren't issues and that they don't have gut issues and they don't need vitamins or special diets. All of that is important, but it's important to, you know, what's the core issue? Because that's really what everybody wants. Everybody wants to know what's the root problem, what's the core issue. And that's where I think, you know, I have a really good understanding of that, and we've been working on that.
Wonderful, thank you. At the end of the day, our families just want to say, so what's step 1, step 2, step 3? What can you tell us?
My wife has always told me this. You know, my wife's a very straightforward, straight shooter. And she's always said to me that, you know, parents sitting in the audience listening to you just want to know, what can you do for my kid, right? And that's the bottom line, and I get it. Although I do think it's important to understand the why and the how and all of that, right? But the bottom line is, I know there is almost no situation where we can't improve the function of the brain. The one thing I know for sure, and right now I'm kind of the world expert in that, and I've published more, is when there are these retained primitive reflexes, I know we can get rid of them. And you know, we grade primitive reflexes in their severity from 0 to 4. 0 is where they should be. Nobody after the age of 1 should have any primitive reflexes. 4 means they're fully there. They haven't gone away at all. 90% of the kids or even adults that we see, when we first see them, their reflexes are all 4s or 3s. And when we work with them, usually within a year, we can get them to 0. When they go from 4 to 0, that's a big shift. And what it represents is a big maturational change to their brain. And so their brain is functioning at a much better level, at a much more mature level. And with that, there is a reduction in their symptoms. And again, you know, the timing on it is always hard, and each child is different, and there's many factors that come into play. But, you know, we know that we can change these things, and we do it on almost every patient that we see, as long as, you know, the parents are doing what we ask them and they're doing all the activities at home and we're working with them and all of that.
And you see families from all over the world.
All over the world.
So, but we're Latin Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and so about Latin Americans and autism in Latin America, what if any, there doesn't need to be one, if any specific, how do you say this in English, feature, it's not a feature, anything specific that you've seen from Latin America in the families that have come, we've come, many people from the Dominican Republic have come and from all over Latin America. What have you seen, the people from LA, that could be the common denominator, let's say, in our families as to, if any, again, because they don't have to be, anything specific in our kids. I'm just trying to pick your brain as to, is there anything from Latin America that stands out?
Right. And that's one of the things about autism. It's what we call heterogeneous, which means that it's kind of not specific to a culture or to a race or to a gender. I mean, it is more specific to males, but that's changing. And that's one of the things that amazes me, is that everywhere in the world I go and everywhere when I see patients, the similarities are striking. That there is very little difference from a child from Latin America, from the UAE, from Israel, from China, from America. They're very similar, right, in that they're features. The one thing that strikes me about the Latin American community is the parents, you know, all parents love their children, but there are some cultures where, you know, they take more action, right? Meaning that if there's something affecting their child, they're going to move heaven and earth to get it done. Some cultures are more accepting that this is the way it is, there's nothing we can do about it, and that's whatever. But what I found in Latin American families is that they're so passionate about their children, and they love their children, and they will do whatever it takes and go anywhere to help their children. And that, to me, is just, amazing. That's what I love about it. I think one of the best things that's ever happened to me in my life was the fact that my book was translated into Spanish, because it's opened this whole world to me, and it's given me, and that's the thing, my book is translated in about 18 languages. And so I see a lot of those different cultures, and I've spent a lot of time in them. But the Latin American community right now, that makes up a large part of our patients in New York, that people that are flying and are coming to see us and following up and incredibly consistent. But the features are the same. We see that, even in the Latin American community, like other people, that, the families and the parents are highly intelligent. They're, very, very bright. They have these left brain skills. And so, the features are really the same all over the world. That's why you look at it, it's not really a genetic problem, because it isn't really specific to a specific culture like many disorders are.
We've seen the testimonial from this famous actor, Kevin James, with his child. And it would be great for us to learn about that story. Why did you pick that story to feature also in your social media and everything? And so, to me, it's a wonderful story. So.
Yeah, I've worked with a number of celebrities, children, and most of them are very private, and they don't want people to know it, right? So I won't say who they are. But with Kevin, he's such a great guy, very spiritual guy. I don't think a lot of people know that about him. But he and his family are wonderful. He's a great father, loves his children. And, really, I think a lot of this came out because he went on Joe Rogan's show. And Joe Rogan is the biggest podcast in the world by far. And he did that very specifically. He told me he was going to do that because, he wanted to help other parents. He wanted to let them know because, his daughter is a brilliant, incredible artist, writer, but, very high-functioning autism spectrum. She had a lot of other issues, and again, things that he talked about. She had terrible eczema. She never slept. She had pretty severe OCD. She struggled, socially. But what happened was, and this really speaks to the overlap of the immune system and everything, is that she would get sick. And like many kids in autism, she didn't she didn't look sick. She didn't get a fever. She didn't feel sick. She didn't act sick, even though she did. And one time it ended up triggering these terrible tics in her. And these tics were really bad. Full body, screaming, yelling, hitting herself. And it came on suddenly, and they were just devastated. And Kevin was away filming a movie, so his wife took the daughter to a hospital, which is the #1 children's hospital in the United States, in New York. And they went to the emergency room, and they literally, said to her, "There's nothing we can do. No one can do anything for this." She was like, "Help my child." They said, "The only thing we can do is maybe medicate her and knock her out, but when she wakes up, the tics are going to be back." And that's exactly what happened. So the wife dove in. She found my book, Disconnected Kids, and she felt like this really spoke to her. And so they reached out to me and asked me if, I could see their daughter and if I could help her. And so once I said, I think I work with a lot of people and kids with different types of tics or stimming behavior or OCD. And neurologically, I know exactly what's happening in their brain. And I know how to change that. Again, how it responds is different in each. But, so we were able to get rid of her tics in about 3 or 4 weeks. And, it was very intense treatment. They were very good about that. We also did things with her diet, and we did things to try to help her sleep. And so, he was so grateful about that he said, other people need to know this. And he would like to do things like be able to do fundraisers and help people. But first thing was him saying, we need to raise awareness of you, of what you do, of your book, and of how, people are told that there's nothing that can be done about this. But, that wasn't his experience.
That's great. And I'm sure that there's thousands of stories like that. Thousands. So
Tens of thousands, really, yes.
Just a final message that to bring hope to our families, if you could look at this camera, and just, there's something to be done. To just, don't listen to no hay cura, there's no cure. So.
Yeah, I think that, you have to, most parents that they know that there's another child in there that's trying to get out. And what I would tell you is, again, first of all, nobody did anything wrong. There's no blame, feeling guilt, or feeling bad that you did something wrong or something. That, you need to eliminate that completely. If anything, what I know is that the reason why, in large part, these particular children end up with this is because they're gifted. You gave them a gift, incredible intelligence. That's another misconception, is that people are told that maybe only 10% of kids with autism have a savant level skills. I believe it's 100% have literally savant level skills, but many of them, because they're not verbal, because they can't speak, because they don't feel and they can't control their body, they can't show it. But we have ways of, in our office, of working with kids. One technique we use is called RPM, Rapid Prompting Method, which allows and helps them to be able to speak using a letterboard where they can type, where they can't write and they can't type yet. And these kids tell us, and they know everything. I had this one 8-year-old boy, I was telling you about this last night, that he started to be able to type with his mother on her phone, and he started talking about quantum physics. They didn't think this kid knew his letters, and he was able to define quantum physics terms. I've had other children that have said that. I know another kid, his name was Grayson. The first time he was able to communicate on a letterboard, he said, "I want to grow up and be a physicist." I've had kids that they said, "What do you want to learn?" And they'd say something like, the anatomical structure of a molecule. I mean, they're brilliant, and they're essentially these geniuses that are trapped in a body that they can't feel and they can't control. That's obviously very frustrating. But that is not the ultimate version. And we're not trying to change anybody. We're not trying to change them as people. We're just trying to bring out the best version of them. And if they have retained primitive reflexes, and if they have all these things like tics and stims and inflammation in their body, this is not the best version of them. And many people, think, well, just leave them. This is the way they were born, and just accept them for who they are. And we want to accept them, of course. We never want a child to feel like they're not accepted and they're not loved. We love them. But don't be complacent. Don't just accept that there's nothing that they can do, because inside that there's this brilliant child in there that's trying to get out, and you're searching, and your search is real. There is a child in there that is amazing and that can change the world. And all my goal is to try to help bring that child out. And I think that, although it's frustrating and it's hard and I know it's expensive and all of this stuff, but if you can, in some way, don't give up. But be smart about it, read, and, again, try to understand what is actually happening. And if you go to someone that can't explain that to you, if you go to somebody that says, well, just give up or just accept it, there's nothing that can be done, I think you should try to find somebody else. Doctor,
thank you. Thank you very much. This is so inspiring. This is not only inspiring, but it's the way that we've worked all this time with our organization is that it's hope based on scientific evidence, on real facts, on real plans, on things that can be done that can improve the lives of our loved one. It could be a child, whatever age. So thank you very much. It has been an honor, a blessing to have you with us. Y a todos ustedes, muchísimas gracias por sintonizar. Este ha sido un Hopecast de nuevo que llena mi corazón de mucha emoción. Y les esperamos en un próximo Hopecast. Un abrazo a todos y Dios les bendiga.